For my oral history project, I interviewed my father, Mike Juzak. His experiences during the Cold War were both very interesting to learn and informative.
I remember thinking that the Russians were evil, that they would try to take over our country if they were given the slightest chance. We all knew that they were just as afraid of us as we were afraid of them, so we felt kind of safe. I remember going to the basement of our school and sitting under a desk or a table during a drill. I only had to do this once or twice when I was very little. I also remember when I was in the first grade that our teacher stopped class and led us in a prayer for the sailors on board the Pueblo, a Navy spy ship that was captured by the North Koreans.
The USS Pueblo was a commissioned ship that was sent on an electronic intelligence mission off the east coast of North Korea. The Pueblo was captured by the North Koreans in January of 1968. This was the first U.S. Navy ship to be taken over on the seas by a foreign military force in over 150 years. 82 surviving crew members were captured and held prisoner for 11 months. To this day, no military action was taken against the North Koreans.
I started working for the United States Navy at a research center called the Naval Air Development Center in Warminster, Pennsylvania. Later it was renamed the Naval Air Warfare Center. I worked directly for the Navy for 13 years and another 9 years for a defense contractor. That's over 20 years of my life working on systems to protect our country as a direct response to the Cold War. I programmed weapon or sensor system software along with simulation software that allowed the new weapons and sensors to be tested in a laboratory instead of doing costly flight tests. Weapon and sensor systems by the 1980s were completely dependent on computers and the software that runs them. By developing and testing these systems in the laboratory, we were able to get these systems into the field in a much shorter time frame than in the past. I was proud of what I was doing and I wanted to tell everyone, but I knew I couldn't. After a few years, I learned how to talk about what I was doing without saying what it really was. Kind of like talking around the issues. Also, after a few years, I realized that no one really cared what I did. During the time I was hired at the Naval Air Development Center, the U.S. under Ronald Reagan was rebuilding our nation's defense capabilities after they were neglected for years by the Carter administration and the Vietnam War, which used research money to support the fighting in Vietnam. Reagan promised many new defense systems. One was even dubbed Star Wars by the media. This weapon system was designed to be a shield for the United States to protect us from incoming nuclear missiles. I worked on parts of this system during my time at the Naval Air Development Center. It was a huge program that had many parts. Some of my sensor work was related to detecting and tracking missiles.
On March 23, 1983, Ronald Reagan proposed the creation of the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars program, was a missile system created with the intent to prevent any missile attacks from any other country, specifically Russia. This program was named Star Wars for some of its abstract and far-fetched ideas, some of which included lasers. I remember you telling me that my great-uncle was killed during the Cold War. What can you tell me about this?
Well, your great-uncle's name was Jim Scully, and he was a pilot of an American airplane, an RB-29 reconnaissance bomber. That's what the RB stood for. It was a spy plane, and it was shot down near the coast of Russia in 1952 by the Russians, by a MiG fighter. And we know that now, you know, but when it happened in 1952, your grandfather's family was told that you know, the plane was shot down or possibly, you know, just crashed and he was missing in action. So that's really all they know about it. You know, through all the years, there was some speculation, and they had some newspaper reports of you know, a plane like that being shot down, but they never really knew for sure until sometime in the early 1990s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War. The Russians and the United States had a committee together to solve some of these missing in action, I guess you call them incidents, and I believe there are about 10 planes, 10 RB-29 spy planes like the one your uncle was on, that were shot down during this time, and I'm sure there are other instances. Anyway, this committee opened up the Russian records to this, and They actually, the Russians admitted that they shot down the plane. They still claim it was over Russian airspace. They never really resolved that. But we went to a big ceremony in the early 1990s just for this plane. Now, your Uncle Jim was the pilot of the plane. There were 13 men on the plane, including him. And the other people on the plane were co-pilot. There was a major who was the commander of the plane, and there were some gunners, because they did have some guns. It was an old B-29 bomber that was converted to be a spy plane. And what they were doing was flying around the edge of the country of Russia, listening to radio traffic, and they had sensors that would pick up radar information. His plane was shot down between the time, it was after the time that the Russians detonated an atomic bomb, but it was before the time they detonated a hydrogen bomb. And then during the Korean War, his squadron was called up, and that whole plane, the plane and all the guys on it, were from Willow Grove, and there's a memorial to him, to that plane over in Willow Grove, a plaque with all their names on it. And so that's the short story of it, but he was a real American hero. The event I think most people remember is the toppling of the Berlin Wall. I remember Reagan giving his famous speech when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." I remember when he called the Soviet Union was an evil empire. Many people in the world and in the United States thought Reagan was wrong to say this. They thought he would start a war. I remember thinking, way to go. Finally someone is speaking to these communists the way many of us felt. That communism was evil and wrong and most of all stupid. When the wall came down in 1989, to me that was the end of the Cold War.
The Cold War was a time of fear and patriotism. The country and the people in it always felt defenseless because of the looming threat of nuclear war. However, the country held itself together in a time of panic. The people pushed themselves to be as good or even better than Russia. The Cold War affected many different people in many different ways. Bad things happened, like my great-uncle being shot down, but good things happened as well, like the moon landing. Although the Russians were always our enemies, I think that they helped us in a way. They pushed us to become a stronger and more united country, and look where that's gotten us today.